Hi, everybody, and welcome to Romans Episode 1 Historical Context. Thanks for giving this a shot, and excuse all my faults and my stuttering and all that stuff. And I want to give you a little warning about this video in particular. We're going to be talking about the historical context behind the letter. And if this gets a little too boring and a little too history for you, uh, you might have to skip it. I don't want you to give up on the series because this first video is so intense. Now, I do believe that why somebody says something is a huge important piece of information to understand what they're actually communicating. So I want to encourage you that if you can get through this video, it'll probably be somewhere around 19 minutes long. But if you can get through it, you'll be better off. So maybe you can. But anyway, nobody's grading you. So if you get through 5 minutes and you're just bored out of your brains, you can skip it, and nobody's gonna hate you. Okay, there's two topics I want to cover. The first is Paul. We're going to talk about his life, his ministry, his goals, and his problems. And then we're going to talk about, for just a couple of minutes, about the church in Rome and what their situation was like. So let's start with Paul. Well, Paul was born in Tarsus to a Jewish family. We know that because of Acts 9:11. And even if I don't quote the scriptures, if you watch the video, you'll see the scriptures off to the side so you can know I'm not making stuff up. Okay? He was also of the tribe of Benjamin. In fact, his name Saul was probably given to him because of the most famous Benjamite, which was Saul, the first king of Israel. Now, Saul was also born a Roman citizen. Now, it's really, really tough to explain how big a deal it is for somebody to be born a Roman citizen, but you just got to believe me, it was basically a get out of jail free card. Not quite that good, but it was up there. To be born a Roman citizen came with some incredible benefits. A lot of times we think of Saul being born with his Jewish name Saul, and then changing his name to Paul, but that's actually not quite accurate. Saul, because he was born a Roman citizen, was born with both a Jewish name Saul and a Roman name Paul or Paulus. So he didn't change his name, he was always Paul. He was just probably known as Saul to the Jews and as Paul to the Romans. But anyway, this is a little tidbit there. The fact that he was born a Roman citizen is indicative that he also came from an affluent family. That is further witnessed by the fact that he was educated by an extremely well-loved and respected rabbi named Gamaliel. Now, the Bible is pretty harsh on the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, but even the Bible has very little bad to say about Gamaliel. If you look at how the Bible treats Gamaliel, it pretty much talks about him in only a positive light. It's a testament to how well Paul lived life to say that he was born a Roman citizen and then educated by a man as famous as Gamaliel. On top of that, Paul was a part of the Pharisaic party. That is, he was a Pharisee. Now, to give you a little context or a little understanding of what it means to be a Pharisee, I want to tell you about the other political parties. Okay, first you had your Sadducees. Your Sadducees were your elitist ruling class in Jerusalem, and nobody liked them. Okay, then you had your Zealots. Your Zealots were your fanatical revolutionaries. Everybody was kind of freaked out by them. And then you had your Essenes, who were your separatist, super religious party that were off doing their crazy little thing. Now, your Pharisees were your well-loved rural pastor type guys. They were down to earth and everybody liked them, and they were there to help you understand the Bible and to help you live life according to the Torah. So to be a part of the Pharisee party was a good thing. I know the Bible is really, really hard on the Pharisees, but that's probably not the way most Jews would have seen the Pharisees. Finally, Paul describes himself as an extremely devoted Jew or a genuine follower of the Torah. He wasn't a hypocrite, and when he describes himself, he talks as he was though as someone who was genuinely trying to do his best, even though he recognizes that he wasn't capable of doing what God really wanted from him. So Paul was a pretty good Jewish guy. Well, when Christianity first gets started, Jesus is executed, he resurrects, and he ascends. The Christian church begins, and the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem starts persecuting those Christians. Well, Paul, as a Jewish leader, is a part of that persecution. And we know from Galatians 1:13 that Paul admits that he himself persecuted Christians. Now, here's a quick note. I've heard people accuse Paul of actually killing Christians, and I've heard people just say, probably not thinking through their words, that Paul killed Christians, but that's more than the Bible actually says. While Paul was there for Stephen's execution, he actually didn't partake in the execution, and never does the Bible say that Paul killed any Christians. So I'm just going to split hairs here and say that Paul did persecute Christians, but not necessarily kill any of them. In any case, he was on his way to a city called Damascus with orders from the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem to arrest Christians when Jesus, after he had died, resurrected, and gone to heaven, shows up as a super bright light and knocks Paul off his horse and basically converts him. That's kind of cool. Jesus himself converted Paul. Well, just like that, Paul becomes a Christian. Immediately, he began proclaiming Christ as the Messiah, and just that quickly, he himself became persecuted by his former bosses. So Paul goes from being one of the most feared Christian persecutors, or let me word it more carefully, one of the most feared persecutors of the Christian church, to becoming one of the number one targets by the persecutors of the Christian church. So that's kind of an interesting little dramatic twist for him. Well, becoming a Christian doesn't solve all his problems. The early church was really hesitant to accept Paul as a Christian. I'm guessing that they probably thought that Paul was doing some kind of double agent type thing where he pretends to be a Christian to figure everything out, and then he's going to turn and arrest everybody. That's probably what the church was thinking. And it took a guy like Barnabas, who was very well respected within the Christian community, to take Paul and introduce him to Christians and say, hey, this guy is a genuine believer. And that's how Paul is finally allowed to be a part of Christianity. It's kind of hard to find a church when you're the number one persecutor of Christianity, apparently. Anyway, Paul bounces around from place to place and eventually goes back to Tarsus, where he's there for a while. Now, I should take just a quick second to explain something. When Jesus was born, he was born a Jew in Judea. Now, he grew up being educated by Jews into a Jewish religion and became the fulfillment of the Jewish prophecy of the Messiah. And he gathered himself some disciples who were Jewish. And when he was executed, he resurrected and he began appearing to Jewish people. And his followers were all Jewish. See, this whole thing about the Messiah, the religion, the ethnicity, everything was Jewish. And so it makes sense that Christ's followers, or Christians, were only Jewish when Christianity first got started. So my whole point here is that when Christianity first got started, it was only Jews who were part of Christianity. Now, over the years, eventually Gentiles started hearing the gospel, and Gentiles started becoming a part of the Christian church. But because Christianity was a Jewish sect, it remained predominantly Jewish. Now, in Antioch of Syria, something unique happened where Jews started preaching the gospel to Gentiles, and so many Gentiles got saved that, as far as the book of Acts is concerned, the first major Christian Gentile church was formed in Antioch. So it's kind of like your Gentile Jerusalem, if you will, for Christianity. Now, Paul, who's living nearby in Tarsus, is recruited, and he serves there in Antioch, the first Gentile Christian church. And there, Paul serves until he's called to serve as a missionary in Acts 13. So, Paul does two really big things for Christianity. First, he writes our New Testament for us. Thanks, Paul. We really appreciate it. It's because of you, guys like me have jobs. But second, he evangelizes most of the world as he knew it, and he does this by 3 missionary trips. Some people will say there's 4, but I think the 4th could be called something else. I'll show you a map in the next slide, by the way, of these places. But the first missionary trip was a simple round trip from Antioch to Cyprus and Turkey and then back. That's in Acts 13 through 14. His second and third missionary journeys went all the way to Greece and back to Antioch. It's the third one that interests us because on his third trip, he stops in Corinth, and there he writes a letter to the Romans. By the way, in this letter to the Romans, Paul is looking towards Rome, and he says, I want to visit you guys. That's a little bit ironic because it's at the end of this trip that Paul is arrested, and he is eventually sent to Rome as a prisoner. Paul didn't know that. He was making plans to go to Rome when God the whole time had it destined out that he was going to go to Rome via Roman imprisonment. But in any case, here we have Antioch, and then he goes to Cyprus and then modern-day Turkey, and that's mission trip number 1. Missions trips 2 and 3 go all the way to Greece, and it's from here that he writes to the Romans. It's probably not in the most accurate spot, sorry about these stars. And I want to show you Spain, because Paul's real goal is eventually to get to Spain. Let's talk about this. See, Paul feels that having evangelized in Asia Minor and Greece and Achaia, he's basically evangelized all of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now I'm going to show you this map again because I think it's kind of interesting. Paul starts a couple of dozen churches, if that, in all of Turkey, Achaia, and Greece. And he says, because of those churches, he has nowhere left to preach the gospel. It's kind of like saying, I started a church in San Diego, I started a church in LA, and so there's nowhere left in Southern California for me to preach the gospel. It might be a slight exaggeration, but that's Paul's mentality. And it's probably because Paul felt that once you started a church, the church was responsible for evangelism. But anyway, I think it's kind of interesting that Paul starts these churches and he thinks, okay, this country's done, on to the next. In any case, Paul feels he's got nowhere left to preach in the Eastern Mediterranean, so he looks west. Now, west is Italy, but there's already an established church there, and Paul wants to preach the gospel where no one has preached before. So he looks even further west, and you have Spain, and there's basically nothing there. So he sets his goal to start a 4th missionary journey to Spain. We don't know if Paul ever even makes it to Spain, but in any case, that's his plan. Now, Paul's got a few major problems if he's ever going to accomplish these goals. Logistically, Spain is way too far from his sending church in Antioch to support a missions trip there. So, if you've got horses and walking around and boats to get your stuff from one place to another, Antioch is pretty much on the other side of the planet as far as Paul is concerned. So that's not going to be a huge help. Now, Rome is close, but he's never been to Rome. So he doesn't know the right people, and he probably needs to prove himself. On top of that, as Paul has gone around sharing the gospel, his message has been interpreted by both Jews and Jewish Christians. So a lot of people think that Paul is preaching things he's not preaching, and they're accusing him of saying a lot of bad things. So if he's going to get help from Rome, he's got this problem that a lot of people are misunderstanding his message, and they're probably thinking he's a little crazy. Finally, Paul is well into his missionary career. He's done 3 missionary trips, and he's noticed something. The influx of Gentiles into Christianity has created major theological and cultural divisions within the Christian church between the Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and this is something that needs to be addressed. So as Paul looks towards Spain, he knows that Rome is probably the one that's going to help him out, but he's got to fix or at least address these issues, and hence we have the letter to Rome. Paul's purpose is first and primarily to get support for a trip to Spain. But he can't just write a simple, hey, will you guys help me out kind of a letter. See, he's got to debunk false accusations before these people are going to get behind him and support him both in prayer and financially. He also has to demonstrate to the Romans that he's theologically sound. So he's going to lay out exactly what he believes about the gospel and about living a life that reflects God's morality. And then finally, he wants to take this opportunity, knowing that when he writes his letter to Rome, because Rome is so well established and such an important location, knowing that his letter is probably going to get published and copied and sent throughout the whole world, he's going to take this opportunity to address major issues facing Christianity. So when Paul is writing to the Romans, yes, simply put, he's trying to get support for a trip to Spain, but the way he has to do it is to debunk all these false accusations, to demonstrate his theological soundness, address major issues facing Christianity, and as a result, we get this incredibly powerful, very clear treaty on Christian belief and doctrine. That's why Romans is so important. It's not the purpose, but the way Paul has to make his point ends up being extremely helpful for Christians to this day. Now, let's talk about the Roman Church. The reason I want to describe or talk about the Romans is because there are parts in the letter that can be kind of confusing if we don't keep in mind exactly who he's writing to. So I just want to make 2 quick points. First, let's talk about the beginning of the Christian church. The church in Rome was probably established very early through those present during Pentecost. Now, if you read Acts chapter 2, the whole Pentecost episode, we found out that some of the first Jews to get saved were from Rome. So it makes a lot of sense that these Jews who were from Rome returned to Rome and they established the first Christian church in Rome. Probably telling their buddies, converting some of them, and all that. Against popular belief, Peter probably had nothing to do with the establishing of the Roman church, even though he might have been there later and possibly have been executed in Rome. Now, what we really need to keep in mind is the demographics of the Roman church. And I want to tell you a little story about what happened in Rome, just to kind of explain why things ended up being the way they're being. So bear with me for a second, okay? Like I said, the visitors who were from Rome and they were visiting in Israel when Pentecost occurred probably went back, they told their buddies about Jesus, got a few of them saved, and suddenly you have a few Jews within a Jewish synagogue in Rome who are now Christians. Now, immediately after that, they probably had to separate from the Jewish synagogue, and that's because even though Christians were Jews, the difference in theology probably didn't allow them to stay together. So they formed 2 separate communities. But, having said that, the leadership and members of the Christian church were initially just Jewish. Some point later, and I don't know if it's very early or maybe a few years down the line, Gentiles did start to be converted and they entered into the Christian community, both in Rome and in other parts of the world. Now, at some point, and we don't know exactly when, just like in Jerusalem and other parts of the world, the Jews started persecuting the Jewish Christians as well as the Gentile Christians. And so you had a little bit of a conflict between the Jews and the Christians in various parts of the world, but in this case we're interested primarily in Rome. See, Rome was the home of the Roman Empire, and that's where Claudius, the emperor of Rome, lived. So when you start a little bit of a brawl in Rome between Jews and Jewish Christians, and you're the emperor of Rome, you're going to just get rid of your whole problem. See, Claudius didn't care what the problem was with these Jews. He just cared that there was a problem, and his solution is just to get rid of everybody. So he kicks out all the Jews. This is recorded in Acts 18:2, but we also know from extra biblical accounts like Suetonius, who writes in Claudius 25, 1 through 5, and he explains that it was this conflict between the Jews about a man named Chrestus, which might have been a misspelling of Christ, that's why Claudius kicked out all the Jews. Now, like I said, the Christian community in Rome started off as only Jewish, but by this time there was Gentiles there too. So even though the leadership was Jewish, by the time this expulsion occurs, it leaves the Christian community without their Jewish leadership and without their Jewish Christian brothers, and suddenly Christianity is only or predominantly Gentile. Now, eventually, yes, Jews were allowed to return home, but the Christian community in Rome was changed forever. The reason I'm telling you all of this is because the church in Rome, when Paul is writing to them, he's assuming that he's writing to a predominantly Gentile church. There's not a lot of Jews there. And we have to remember this as we read Paul's letter to the Romans. Okay, I know I just threw a lot at you. So I want you to just think of 3 things. If you forget everything else, well, that's not a good thing, but at least these 3 things will keep us going for the next video. The letter to the Romans was intended to raise support for a trip to Spain. Now, in order to do that, he needed to clear the air about some accusations and about what exactly he was teaching, but he was also going to take the opportunity to address major issues facing Christianity. And then finally, it was written primarily to a Gentile Roman Christian church. That is, Paul is not writing to Jews or Jewish Christians. He's writing to Christians who are Gentiles. And we're going to have to keep that in mind in some parts where it gets a little confusing. Now, I want to say one last thing. As you're watching this, you probably have questions or comments, hopefully not hate mail, but whatever. Send your emails to BibleQA@outlook.com, BibleQA@outlook.com, and I will respond via this type of video. Anyway, I hope you like this and you stick around for the rest of the series. Thanks.